this episode of Quake It Up. In this episode, I'm going to be finally, after talking about it for so long and not actually doing it, I'm going to be talking about starting my playlist on the Quaker Testimonies. I'll be talking first about what they are and why I've chosen to do it in the way that I've done it, and then basically each video will have sort of maybe a history of it, of that testimony, and what that has meant for Quakers throughout their history, what it means for Quakers today, some examples of things that people can try, and things like that. There are some people that don't actually use the word testimonies at all in any sort of systematized way. People might talk about Quaker values, for example, or things that Quakers uphold. But there are others who find that sort of more systematized format useful. This all came about originally from Howard Brinton in his book, Friends for 300 Years. It was the first time that Quaker testimonies were talked about in this way and systematized in this way, and this has changed into lots of other ways of Quakers talking about how they talk about testimonies. I've done a video on that, so if you want to check out that and the sort of the introduction of this style of talking about Quaker values, Quaker testimonies, please do check that one out. So the way that I'm going to be looking at this is going to be looking at four testimonies or values. Maybe we can have a look at the difference between those two words. And they are going to be simplicity, which is what this video is on, truth, equality, and peace. So that forms the acronym STEP, which is what I think is more of a British thing. In America, I know they use spices, which include other things as well. So maybe I might expand that to include some of those things as well. But I'm going to be focusing with those first four, which I think everyone would sort of say, these are kind of hallmark Quaker values, Quaker testimonies. And so it's a good place to start to kind of get a good idea of what a Quaker life might look like and what Quakerism demands of you, so to speak. So I suppose just looking at that difference maybe between values and testimony, because if you look at ideals like simplicity, truth, equality, peace, these aren't necessarily inherently Christian values. Obviously, everyone, I think most people would agree with that. You can uphold these values just as well as a non-Christian person as you can as a Christian. I suppose maybe your reasons for it, your rationale might be different. And I say that if you were a Christian Quaker, you would probably be more comfortable with the word testimony. And if you are a non-theist Quaker, you probably would feel more comfortable with the term value. But I think, I don't think the word value needs to be clarified in any particular way to a 21st century audience. However, I think the word testimony, especially in the Quaker context, maybe does, just because normally in a religious context, when you talk about a testimony, that's normally about some person talking about how they came to Jesus or something like that, their sort of path to becoming Christian, which isn't quite what this is. But I think the testimony from a Quaker perspective, and this is my own take on it, so if I'm wrong, then tell me. But I think what it mainly means is sort of setting yourself out as a sign. Obviously, this is what a lot of the early Quakers were doing and wanted their lives to be, a sign that the Holy Spirit had come, that they were in communion with the Holy Spirit, and this is what that led their lives to be like. So I think it's kind of more coming from that than talking about why you're a Christian. So with that all kind of discussed, hopefully, let's go on with talking about what simplicity looks like, what Quakers mean when they talk about simplicity. So simplicity, I would say, well, I think they all are, I suppose, and this is why they're so Quaker. They're all. It goes right back to the very beginning of Quakerism, and right back to that idea of what the early Quakers were fighting against when they moved away from the Church of England. It was simplicity on all levels. It was simplicity not only in how they worshipped. So, for example, the simple style of worship of waiting in silence, no Lord's Supper, no baptism, no stained glass windows, no incense or any of that. So really simple worship style. It also meant about how they acted in society as well, foregoing formalities, for example. And so over the course of Quaker history, this has taken on many different aspects, some of which have lived to today, some that which have not, some that which maybe could be brought back and maybe repurposed. And we'll kind of just have a look at some of those now. So as well as plain speech, which was very important to the early Quakers, again, probably less so now, um, the idea of not using formalities or titles when talking to those above you or of an equal station, really. Just using simple language when talking to people was really important. But going and beyond this, plain dress was probably up until, going into the 19th century, plain dress was probably the main way that people in the past would recognize a Quaker. And this ultimately derived from the testimony of simplicity. So this idea that you shouldn't make yourself into um, an idol, effectively, so that you should dress plainly because only God has glory and all that kind of thing. So that you dress plainly so that the focus isn't on you, the focus is on your relationship with the inward light and so on. There are still some Quakers that do this today, not very many, certainly not very many in the UK at all. I've never met a British plain dress friend. Be amazing to know if there were some out there. I know there are way more in America, but I think the idea of dressing plainly, I think, is something that is still very important to Quakers. So, for example, the way that could be looking in the modern world would be maybe not looking at branding so much, not spending inordinate money on clothes, and also just looking about the provenance of many clothes brands, because as we know, by buying clothes that come from factories which has poor labor laws, for example, then that is obviously not something that Quakers would want to uphold. Another way that I think the testimony of simplicity has come out throughout Quaker history is that there has been a tendency to um, avoid excess. So things like drink, drugs, gambling, music, the theatre, all things where that seemed maybe a bit excessive, too fun, one could argue, with some of those things like music, then Quakers would avoid, because that's making life too complicated, especially with things like alcohol and drugs and so on. The potential that could also hinder the testimony to truth, which I'll talk about later, is also very important, because if you drink or take drugs and say things that aren't true, then obviously from a Quaker perspective, then that's a big no-no. I'd say for modern Quakers, I'd say that simplicity is a really good testimony or value, whatever word you want to use, is a really good place to start living more Quakerly, because it's something that you can actively do something about. I've said before, I'm not sure where, maybe I remember and I'll put a link, but the way that I see the testimonies often is that, you've got simplicity and truth, which are things which you can do something about, because they start with you. You can start being more truthful. You can start being more simple. Whereas equality and peace kind of require another person, or another group of people in order to be equal with or peaceful with. And so when you're starting your kind of Quaker journey, I'd say that starting with simplicity and truth are probably easier. For example, with simplicity, things that we can do, a lot of the ways that simplicity has been re-understood nowadays is by looking about living more sustainably. So, and that can be, many different angles of that. So that could be things like choosing what you eat more carefully, what you wear, as I've already talked about, more carefully. Um, Use of public transport versus private transport, use of planes. Just thinking about the global impact of your actions and how you can avoid that to be more simple, environmentally, ecologically. I also think there's a really big lesson to be learned in with simplicity when it comes to how we speak as well. Obviously, I'm not saying we should go back to using thou and thee. I think that's we've moved on from that, and I think rightly so. But what we could be doing is, I think it's something that we could look at every day. Just looking at ourselves and thinking about how we can go about what we mean succinctly, instead of not saying be rude, obviously, but just trying and to remove some of the unnecessary comments, to get to the heart of the matter a bit more quicker. Like people have also looked at it as a form of mindfulness as well, so to try and like make your life and your mind more simple, so that you're not getting wound up and confused with multitudinous thoughts going on in your head, and taking a step back and simplifying all that, I think, is really valuable as well. So I think that's another way that people look at simplicity. To kind of finish this off then, I think I wanted to have a look at the advices and queries, and just which I've done a whole other video on it, so please do have a look at all that way. Look at that in a bit more detail, but I just wanted to have a look maybe at the one advice and query, which I think relates best to simplicity, and it's number 41, which starts off very simply: try to live simply. A simple lifestyle freely chosen is a source of strength. Do not be persuaded into buying what you do not need or cannot afford. Do you keep yourself informed about the effects of your lifestyle of living is having on the global economy and environment? So in there, as I said, it's not looking so much at language or clothing or even necessarily religious style, which is obviously where this all started. This is asking you to think about fiscal simplicity, I suppose, and also looking at sustainability and the environment as well, in terms of like how the impact of what you're buying. So I suppose that is certainly the modern aspect of how the testimony of simplicity is being understood today by Quakers. So I hope that's been interesting. Obviously, I think the Quaker testimony of simplicity is a principle which has been used right from the very beginning of Quakerism, and it has changed, obviously, in order to fit in with the needs of Quakers throughout the ages. It's moved from being mainly a sort of a revolt against the very formalistic society that Quakers started in, and the traditions that they saw in the church they thought were distractions away from true worship, into now what we now have, where we're thinking more about not only the world around us and our effect on the world, but also on our mental health as well, and how being more simple can help us internally as well, and therefore helping, if we're feeling better internally, feeling better as a community and using each other's community in order to be more simple. And so I think for this reason, it's remained one of like the core principles, the core testimony, the core value of Quaker life, right from the very inception. So that's simplicity done. Next time, we'll be moving on to truth, which is a big one amongst Quakers. So I'll catch you then.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.